short time ago, I decided that I would run Classic Traveller role-playing game, a game that's been around for a long time. From Wikipedia, it says it's been around since 1977. Well, that seems like a long time ago. 1977, as I recall, because I wasn't alive then. I think I was about 10 or 11. Was a little bit of a strange time for me. It's one of those areas of my memory that I just can't piece together. I do remember the music was pretty good towards the end of the 70s. It turned better in the 80s, of course. And I started playing role-playing games around that time, 12 or 13 years. And Traveller was one of the first games that I ever played. So what I wanted to do is I want to relive that a little bit, and with the current situation of playing online and people being stuck at home, I decided that I'd try this on Roll20. I've played Traveller a number of times over the years. It's been a good game, but finding people that want to play it and appreciate it in the way that I do has been a challenge. It's not always been easy. Now, with Roll20 and the ability to get people from all around the world to play, we've got the opportunity to maybe have some people that really want to play, and hopefully they'll want to play the game that I want to play. As I'm the one running it, do they have a choice? Well, of course they do. So in this respect, what I wanted is to do an introduction to Traveller and do some bite-sized pieces and introduction to how the rules work, my idea of how the rules work anyway. There'll be some pieces that'll be different from the main books. There'll be some little bits of rules that some people will think, why are they still in there? I quite like that. And I'd like everybody, if you do watch this, trying to pick up the rules for Classic Traveller, to have a good idea at the end of these little sound bites, these little segments that you can go in and just get playing and hopefully relive some of that past. Anyway, let's get on with it then. So, back to the history of role-playing games, what was going on at the time. Well, going on at the time, back in 1977, as far as I'm aware, I think the only other role-playing game that was anywhere close to being in the UK would be Dungeons & Dragons. There were a few other games floating around as well, maybe from Chaosium, but I didn't see them. It really was just Dungeons & Dragons and Traveller for me. My close friends got a copy of Traveller in the box with all of the books, and he started putting it together and said, look, this is a role-playing game and it's going to be in space, and it sounded wonderful. Of course, this was around the time, 1978, 1979, when science fiction movies were making a little bit of a break into the mainstream. We had things like Star Wars, we had Alien, of course. The 70s were a time of tremendous science fiction movies. Just looking back on a list, I'm just going to read a couple just to get you in the mood. Logan's Run, THX 1138, Rollerball, The Black Hole, Star Trek, Planet of the Apes, Damnation Alley, The Omega Man, The Andromeda Strain, Westworld. All of these were 70s films, and they set this ear in my head when I started playing role-playing games that you could live out those adventures that you would see, and that appealed to me much more than fantasy adventures. Nothing wrong with fantasy adventures. D&D is a fantastic game. It opened up that whole Tolkien-esque type world to an awful lot of people that, well, just really wasn't me. But Traveller opened up a different world. Anyway, when Traveller came along, we collected the main books 1, 2 and 3, which I'm going to talk about in the next video. And what they did was they were a basis of how to play a role-playing game that in many respects was growing up from a war game. And some would argue that it never did grow up from a war game. It remained the same. So when we get down to the rules, I'm going to keep that in mind. And I'm going to approach this a little bit like Traveller is a war game. It tries to be a role-playing game, as opposed to the other way around. Now, Traveller fans, if you're watching this, and you may do, you're going to react against that. Please don't take it the wrong way. I think Traveller is a wonderful game. I think it's a wonderful role-playing game. I think you just have to work hard to make it a role-playing game. And I would level the same geek at first edition Dungeons and Dragons, which in many respects felt like a war game turned into a role-playing game, which I think, if we look back in the history books, it's so the 70s, with all of those different elements to it that those people that weren't born in the 70s could look back upon now and giggle a little bit at the clothes and maybe the hairstyles and the music. It did open up a creative landscape when it comes to something like role-playing games for people like me. I lived in a small village where if you managed to get out on your bike or whatever it would be, the only other place you could go to was a small village. I didn't live in a big city or a big town where there were loads of other things going on, so role-playing games were a great escape for me to do things, especially in autumn and winter when it was dark and it was cold and it was raining, as it probably feels like it always does in Britain. And it opened my mind up to that. It stayed with me until this day. And given the fact that I'm talking about the late 70s, you can probably guess how old I am now. Right, without further ado then, let's get into what Traveller the Role-Playing Game is. So Traveller the Role-Playing Game is one of the very first, I think a lot of people would think, one of the first 3 or 4 main role-playing games to be created. There was D&D, you had RuneQuest, Tunnels and Trolls, and Traveller. And when Traveller started, you could buy Traveller in separate books or books altogether in a set, and that's how we were introduced to it. When you look at Traveller today, you look at when it was produced, you look at the typeset, you look at the artwork or the lack of the artwork. It looks really old-fashioned, but it's the sort of game that people with analytical brains and minds probably will like. If you like a good spreadsheet, you're going to like Traveller, which sounds a bit odd, I know, but sometimes people do like a good spreadsheet. There's an order to it. There's a simplicity in that order as well. It does mean, though, that in essence the rules are open for interpretation all across the board. Unlike a lot of role-playing games as they leaked into the 80s and you got book after book after book and compendium after compendium with more and more rules, Traveller really stuck to the core rules and added more background, equipment, systems, places to be. It did add a few more pieces to the rules as well, but ultimately the main rules for the game can be found in the first 3 books, of which the page count of those 3 would add up to a little less than 150, 140 pages. In the next video, I'm going to be looking at the books themselves. You'll see just what I mean about that old-fashioned typefacing, that old-fashioned layout. You know, the thing that I love about this is that at the time, it felt like it's a work of passion, just like D&D, just like all of those books back then. They were wondrous devices to engage your imagination. So I'm going to move on to part 2. So catch me in part 2. Going to be looking at the main books, books 1, 2, 3, and maybe a few others as well. And we shall get started with the idea of how the rules work, and then how do we make some characters. Okay, so keep watching.